40 years. That is how long one man lived inside the Native American nations of the American South, eating their food, learning their languages, sleeping in their towns, walking their trails from the Mississippi River all the way to the Carolinas. He was not a missionary. He was not a soldier. He was not there to convert anyone. He was a trader, a man who made his living by being trusted on both sides of a frontier. And in 1775, 1 year before the Declaration of Independence was signed, that man sat down in London and published a book that made a claim so strange that most Americans today have never even heard it said out loud. He wrote that the people he had lived among were not strangers to the Bible. He wrote that their purity laws, their yearly festivals, their sacred fire, their clan divisions, their towns of refuge for a man who killed by accident, and even the sound they cried out in their most solemn songs, all of it lined up with the ancient customs of Israel. And then he wrote the sentence that ended his reputation in polite academic company. He said these nations were, in his judgment, the descendants of the 10 tribes of Israel, the tribes that vanished from the record 2,500 years ago and were never confirmed found. His name was James Adair. The book was called The History of the American Indians. It was printed in London. It was read. It was argued over in drawing rooms and in pulpits. And then, somewhere between the 1800s and the classroom you sat in as a child, it quietly fell out of the story America tells about itself. Tonight, we're opening that book back up. So here is exactly what you are going to get in the next few minutes. You are going to hear the specific customs Adair recorded with his own eyes. Not vague ones, the specific ones, the ones that made him stop and write them down. You are going to hear why a first-hand account written over 4 decades ended up shelved, while shorter, thinner books became the standard. And you are going to hear what modern scholars say about him today, because that answer is stranger than most people expect. Then you are going to be asked, at the end, to decide something for yourself. I am not going to tell you Adair was right. I am going to show you what he wrote and let you weigh it. Now, before we walk into his world, we need one piece of ground under our feet. In the 8th century before the Common Era, the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Assyrian Empire. The book of 2 Kings records that the population was carried away and resettled in distant provinces. And after that, the 10 northern tribes stop appearing in the record as a nation. They do not get a final chapter. They do not get a burial. They simply stop being mentioned. In our last video, we looked at an old text that used the phrase Arzareth for the place they went, and thousands of you filled the comments with one word, over and over, America. I read those comments. I did not expect what I found when I went looking, because it turns out that centuries before any of us were arguing about it online, a man had already gone and lived the experiment. He did not theorize from a library in Europe. He went and he stayed and he took notes for 40 years. So let us meet him properly. James Adair was born around 1709 in Ulster in the north of Ireland, a subject of the British Crown, which is why you will often see him called an Englishman in older sources. He crossed the Atlantic as a young man around the 1730s and went into the deerskin trade out of Charleston, South Carolina. Understand what that job actually was because it matters for everything that follows. A deerskin trader did not visit, he embedded. He lived in the towns. He married into families. He carried goods hundreds of miles on horseback through country where a white man traveling alone was entirely dependent on the goodwill of his hosts. And Adair traded primarily among the Chickasaw, and he spent long periods among the Cherokee. He also moved among the Muskogee Creek and the Choctaw. He learned to speak with them. He sat in their council houses. He went with them on the trail. He was there through wars, through epidemics, through the collapse and reshaping of whole alliances during the long contest between Britain, France, and Spain for the American interior. And here is the detail that should make you lean forward. He did not go there looking for Israel. He went there to sell cloth and buy skins. The conclusion came later. It came slowly, and by his own account, it came from the accumulation of things he could not explain any other way. Which brings us to the part of the book that people either dismiss in one sentence or cannot stop thinking about for the rest of their lives. Because Adair did not simply assert his claim, he organized it. When the History of the American Indians was printed in London in 1775, the core of it was a series of arguments, 23 of them, laid out one after another, like a prosecutor building a case. Let us walk through the strongest ones. The first thing that struck him was the purity law. Adair recorded that in the towns where he lived, a woman, during her monthly cycle, withdrew from the household to a separate small dwelling and remained apart until a set period had passed, and that during that time she did not prepare food for others and was not touched. He recorded washings before sacred occasions. He recorded that contact with a dead body made a person ritually unfit until a purification was completed. And Adair, who had read his Bible, sat there and thought about the book of Leviticus and the book of Numbers, which prescribes a purification period after touching the dead. He wrote that he could not find a practical reason for these rules in the daily life around him. They were not about medicine as he understood it. They were about a category he called cleanness. That was the first stone. Then he found the second. Adair described nations that were not simply groups of families, but formal divisions with names, and he noted that a person belonged to their mother's division, and that a person could not marry inside their own. He wrote about that structure and thought of Israel divided into tribes, with descent and inheritance carefully tracked. Now, I want to be straight with you here, because you will find this in the comments within the hour. The Cherokee clan system, as it is documented, has 7 clans, not 12. Adair was not describing a perfect one-to-one match, and he did not claim one. He was describing a nation organized by hereditary divisions with marriage rules in an era when most Europeans expected to find nothing of the kind. Fair or unfair? Put your verdict in the comments. I want to see both sides on this one. Then came the third stone, and this is the one that stops people cold. Adair wrote about towns of refuge. He recorded that among the Cherokee and among the Creek, certain towns held a particular status, that within them blood vengeance was suspended, that a man who had killed another, especially without intent, could reach that town and not be struck down inside it. If you know the book of Numbers, you already feel it. Ancient Israel had cities of refuge, 6 of them, set aside by law, so that a man who killed accidentally could flee there and be protected from the avenger of blood until judgment was made. Adair looked at a sanctuary town in the American Southeast in the 1700s and wrote down that he was looking at the same institution. But the customs he recorded next were, in his words, even harder to account for. Because Adair described the year itself. He wrote that these nations counted time by moons, and that the appearance of a new moon was marked. And he described the great annual festival held when the new corn ripened, the ceremony English speakers came to call the green corn ceremony, and which the nations themselves called by their own names. Listen to what he recorded about it. Before the festival, the people fasted. Every fire in the town was extinguished. Every hearth went cold. Then a new fire was kindled by the appointed men, and from that single new fire, every household fire in the town was relit. Offenses were forgiven. Old quarrels were set down. Debts and grudges from the previous year were released, and the year began clean. And no one ate the new corn until the ceremony had been completed. Adair, sitting in the smoke of that fire, wrote about the Feast of First Fruits, about a day of atonement, about a new year that begins with cleansing and release. Then he wrote about food. He recorded restrictions, that certain creatures were not eaten, that blood was carefully drained rather than consumed, that particular portions of an animal were set aside rather than taken. And he noted that when he asked why, he was not given a practical answer. He was given the answer that it was simply not done. Now we come to two things that Adair treated as his strongest evidence, and I have deliberately saved them for last. The first is the sacred enclosure. Adair described an inner area within the town's ceremonial house, treated as set apart, which ordinary people did not enter. And he described a man who held a religious office, distinguished in dress and in conduct, who prepared himself before officiating. He described objects carried by that office and a container carried on the war trail, a sacred bundle borne ahead of the party, which no one but its appointed keeper was to handle, and which was set down with care and never placed on bare ground carelessly. Adair called it an ark. He wrote it in those words, and he meant exactly what you think he meant. He was thinking of the sacred chest carried before the armies of Israel, which no unauthorized hand was to touch. And the second thing, the sound. Adair wrote that in the most solemn ceremonial songs he heard, the singers repeated syllables that he transcribed in his own spelling as something close to yo-hey-wah, and a shorter form he wrote as Yah. He argued that this was not a random vocal pattern. He argued that he was hearing the ancient divine name of Israel worn down by 25 centuries of separation, preserved in a song by people who no longer had a written text to check it against. That is the claim. That is the sentence that has kept this book alive in certain circles for 250 years, no matter how many times it has been dismissed. Now, here is the honest counterweight, and I am giving it to you because you deserve it. Linguists have a term for syllables sung in ceremony that carry no dictionary meaning. They are called vocables. They exist in the musical traditions of many peoples all over the world, and they are extremely common in Native American ceremonial song. To a trained ear, a repeated syllable in a song is not automatically a name. And that is the fault line this entire subject sits on. So let me ask you directly, because I want this argued in the comments. If you had personally sat in that townhouse for 40 years and heard that sound repeated in the most sacred moment of the year, would you have written it down as coincidence, or would you have written what Adair wrote? Type coincidence or conviction and tell me why. Now I want you to see the man himself, because a document is only as good as the person holding the pen. Picture the American Southeast in the 1740s and 50s. There is no United States. There are no state lines. There are no photographs and no reliable maps of the interior. There are river systems, and there are nations. The Chickasaw in what is now northern Mississippi, the Cherokee in southern Appalachians, the Creek towns across Georgia and Alabama, the Choctaw to the south. And moving through it all are men with pack horses, carrying cloth, metal tools, and ammunition inland, and carrying out bundles of deerskin worth a fortune in London. Adair was one of those men for the better part of 4 decades. He learned the etiquette. He knew who to speak to first when he entered a town, and what silence meant, and what a gift meant. He was present during the long Chickasaw resistance against French pressure and their allies, a conflict that shaped the entire lower Mississippi Valley. He was, at various points, involved in colonial affairs and frustrated by them, and he did not think much of the officials in Charleston. That frustration bleeds through the book, and it is one of the reasons the book reads the way it does. Because Adair was not writing to flatter anyone. He wrote with irritation at Europeans who described native nations from a distance, in a chair, having never eaten a meal in one of their houses. He had contempt for second-hand accounts, and he made a point of saying again and again that he was reporting what he had personally seen. And think for a moment about the physical act of writing this thing. There was no desk. There was no library to check a reference against. There was no way to look anything up. Adair was assembling a 400-page manuscript out of decades of memory and notes in a world of pack horses and river crossings and canvas, and papers in that climate did not survive carelessness. He carried that manuscript for years. He revised it. He complained about the difficulty of getting it into print, and eventually it crossed the Atlantic and went to a London printing house, and in 1775 it came off the press, addressed to an English reading public that had never seen a Chickasaw town and never would. Think about the timing for a second. 1775, Lexington and Concord. The colonies were about to tear themselves away from the very city where his book was being printed. Within a year, London had rather larger concerns than a trader's theory about the interior of a continent it was in the process of losing. That alone may explain more about this book's reception than any conspiracy ever could. Was he a perfect observer? No, no one was in that century. He wrote inside the assumptions of his own age. He was interpreting a living culture through a book he had grown up with. He sometimes made a parallel sound tighter than it was. But here is what even his critics have conceded. The man was actually there. He is one of the very few Europeans of that generation who left a detailed, sustained, inside description of Chickasaw and Cherokee life in the mid-1700s, the language, the food, the medicine, the war customs, the law, the ceremonies, the seasonal round. Which raises the question that this entire video has been walking toward. If a book like that exists, written by a man like that, why did most of us grow up never hearing his name? There is a dramatic answer, and there is a truthful answer, and I would rather give you the truthful one, because it is actually more interesting. The truthful answer has 3 parts. First, the method. Adair argued by resemblance. He saw a purity law, and he matched it to Leviticus. He saw a refuge town, and he matched it to Numbers. But resemblance is not descent. Anthropologists later documented purity restrictions, first fruits festivals, sanctuary sites, and clan marriage rules across dozens of unrelated societies on every inhabited continent. Peoples who never met, never traded, never shared a single ancestor within recorded history. Human societies facing similar problems arrive at similar answers. That is not a scandal. It is a pattern. And there is the harder problem. Adair was a man who knew the Bible extremely well, looking at a culture he wanted to understand and reaching for the framework he already had. Second, the evidence that arrived after him. In the 1800s, comparative linguistics matured into a real discipline, and when scholars systematically compared the structure of Muskogean and Iroquoian languages with Hebrew and the other Semitic languages, the relationship Adair had proposed did not hold up. Then archaeology, and then genetics pointed the ancestry of Native American peoples to Northeast Asia, entering the continent by way of Beringia, a migration many thousands of years older than the Assyrian Empire. That is the mainstream scientific position today, and I am not going to pretend otherwise to you. But here is the third part, and this is the part that almost never gets said out loud. The book was not buried. It was absorbed. Adair's arguments did not vanish in 1775. They were picked up and carried forward in American religious writing for the next 50 years. Elias Boudinot, a prominent early American statesman and the first president of the American Bible Society, published a work in 1816 arguing the Hebrew origin of Native Americans and drew directly on this material. Ethan Smith published a similar work in 1823. Adair's observations circulated widely in the young American United States. They shaped a whole current of 19th century American religious imagination, and his book never actually died. In 2005, the University of Alabama Press published a full annotated scholarly edition of the history of the American Indians, not as scripture, not as proof, as a primary source, because historians of the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, and the Creek still cite Adair for his descriptions of 18th century life, even while setting his conclusion aside. Read that again because it is the strangest fact in this whole story. The academic world kept his evidence and dropped his verdict. So which is it, buried or retired for cause? Type buried or retired, and I will read them. Now, let us do one comparison, and then we are going to talk about you. The exile itself is not disputed. The book of 2 Kings records the deportation of the northern kingdom into distant Assyrian provinces. What the canonical prophets add is a promise about the return, and the geography in that promise is worth hearing. The book of Isaiah speaks of the scattered being recovered from the four corners of the earth, and specifically names the islands or coastlands of the sea. The book of Deuteronomy speaks of the driven being gathered from the outermost parts under heaven. The book of Jeremiah speaks of them being brought back from the far coasts of the earth. Notice what those texts do and do not say. They do not name a continent. They do not draw a map. They do not say America. What they do say, consistently, is far, farther than the exile itself, at the edges, across water. And that is precisely the gap James Adair walked into. He was not claiming to have found a verse that said America. He was claiming that he had spent 40 years standing in a place at the far edge of the known world, among people the prophets could not have named, and had found practices he could not otherwise explain. Two sources, 25 centuries apart, and a shape that seems to line up. Or a man who knew one text so well that he read it into everything he saw. That is the honest choice on the table, and it has been on the table since 1775. So here is the part that is actually about you. You did not learn this in school. Almost nobody watching this did. You learned about the deerskin trade, maybe. You learned about the frontier. You learned a date and a treaty and moved on. But somewhere in that curriculum, a man who lived 4 decades inside those nations and wrote 400 pages about what he saw got compressed down to nothing. And I want to be careful here, because this is where a lot of channels reach for a villain, and I do not think the honest answer is a villain. I think the honest answer is how knowledge gets thrown away. When a theory is discredited, the observations attached to it usually go into the trash with it. The conclusion was wrong, so the notebook gets closed, and the century of testimony inside that notebook goes quiet with it. That happens constantly. It is happening right now to sources we have not looked at yet. And there is a second thing that happened here, and it deserves to be said plainly. The people whose customs Adair recorded were almost never asked what they thought their own origins were. Europeans debated where Native Americans came from at great length for 300 years, largely without them in the room. The Chickasaw Nation, the Cherokee Nation, and the Muskogee Nation are not historical footnotes. They exist right now. They have their own histories, their own scholars, and their own accounts of who they are and where they come from. Any honest conversation about this subject has to hold that at the center, not at the margin. So no, I am not going to end this by telling you that James Adair proved anything. What I will tell you is this. A man with no obvious motive to lie, who had nothing to gain and a reputation to lose, spent 40 years inside a world almost no European of his generation entered, and he came out of it convinced enough to put his name on a book in London and say it in public. He may have been wrong. He may have been a good observer with the wrong framework, which is one of the most common ways to be wrong in all of history. But he was there, and there is a difference between being wrong and irrelevant. So I am handing it to you. Do you think James Adair genuinely documented something ancient and unexplained? Or do you think he was a Bible reader who found exactly the pattern he brought with him? Do not just pick a side. Tell me which specific custom moved you and which one you think falls apart. If you think the refuge towns are the strongest piece, say so. If you think the sound in the songs is the only piece that actually matters, say that. And if you think the whole thing collapses on the linguistics, argue it. I want that comment in there, because a comment section with only one opinion in it is not a conversation. Last thing, and I mean this. After the Arzareth video, thousands of you wrote the same thing in the comments in different words. You kept saying, "Look west." You kept saying, "America." You kept saying, "Somebody already wrote this down, go find it." You were the reason I went looking for James Adair. This video exists because of that comment section, so thank you, sincerely. And there is more in that book. There is a great deal more, because there are other witnesses in other centuries on other continents who wrote down things that sound uncomfortably similar, and some of them never read Adair and never could have. That is where we are going next. If you want to be there when we open the next document, subscribe and turn on the bell, because these are the ones that get lost. Until then, keep asking better questions than the ones you were handed. I will see you in the next one.